When we think of the Eastern Front in World War II, we picture steel, millions of tons of armor clashing in the frozen mud, the unstoppable waves of T-34 tanks pushing the German Wehrmacht back to the gates of Berlin. This is the romantic, cinematic version of the war, a Hollywood narrative of infinite Soviet manpower and limitless factories churning out tanks beyond the Ural Mountains. But military professionals know a cold, hard truth. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics. A tank is just a 30-ton steel coffin if it lacks the fuel to run, the armor-piercing shells to fire, or the daily rations for its crew. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union was bleeding out. The German blitzkrieg had captured the industrial heartlands of Ukraine and Western Russia. The Soviets lost territories that produced more than 60% of their coal and steel. To survive, they evacuated their factories to the east, literally rebuilding them in the snow. But an economy running on bare survival mode cannot produce everything. They focused entirely on weapons, leaving a catastrophic void in basic infrastructure. For decades, Soviet post-war propaganda hammered home a specific narrative to cover up this void, that the Western Allies provided a mere 4% of the USSR's total wartime production, a statistical drop in the ocean. But this 4% is one of the most brilliant and deceptive statistical manipulations of the 20th century. Today, we strip away the ideological myths. We will look at the brutal pragmatics of the Lend-Lease program, how American trucks, aviation fuel, and millions of cans of meat became the artificial life support system that saved the Soviet war machine from total logistical collapse. Let's dissect this 4% myth. The Soviet statisticians calculated the value of Lend-Lease against their entire national output, including raw agriculture and basic domestic goods. But you cannot fire wheat from a cannon. To understand the true impact, we must look at the critical bottlenecks of war production, the materials the Soviet Union simply could not manufacture. Take aviation. The legendary Soviet Il-2 Stormovik was the most produced combat aircraft in history. But what was it made of? The Soviet Union suffered a catastrophic shortage of aviation aluminum. Over 50% of the aluminum used in Soviet aircraft construction came from the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. And once those planes were built, how did they fly? Soviet refineries were technologically incapable of producing the high-octane aviation fuel required for high-performance combat engines. The Allies shipped over 2.5 million tons of high-octane avgas to the USSR. Without Western fuel and aluminum, the massive Soviet Air Force would have been entirely grounded, ceding the skies to the German Luftwaffe. Now, look at firepower. The devastating Soviet artillery barrages are legendary, but over half of the TNT, gunpowder, and high explosives packed into Soviet shells and bombs was American-made. But perhaps the most shocking statistic lies in the steel arteries of the nation. During the war, the USSR focused entirely on building tanks and guns. They virtually stopped producing railway rails. A staggering 92% of all railroad tracks laid in the Soviet Union during the war were shipped from America, along with nearly 2,000 heavy steam locomotives. Furthermore, an army needs to communicate. We previously discussed how the lack of radios crippled the Red Army in 1941. Lend-Lease solved this by delivering over 400,000 field telephones and 1 million miles of copper wire. The United States provided the very nervous system that kept the massive Soviet military machine connected.
Producing weapons is only half the battle. You have to move them. By 1943, the Red Army was on the offensive, pushing the Germans back. But an advancing army stretches its supply lines to the breaking point. This is where the Soviet Union faced a fatal mobility crisis. The standard Soviet cargo truck, the Gaz AA, was a fragile, underpowered copy of a 1920s Ford. It constantly broke down and sank helplessly in the notorious Russian mud. Enter the Studebaker US6, a six-wheel drive logistical monster built in Indiana. America shipped over 400,000 heavy trucks and Willys Jeeps to the USSR. Before this, Soviet artillery pieces were dragged through the mud by starving horses or exhausted agricultural tractors. The Studebaker gave the Red Army true operational mobility. It was so reliable and powerful that it became the standard platform for the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket launchers. When Soviet generals planned their massive deep battle encirclements, like the destruction of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, they executed those plans on American rubber and Detroit engines. Without these trucks, the Soviet infantry would have outpaced their own artillery, leaving them vulnerable to German counterattacks. And speaking of infantry, you cannot march a soldier to Berlin barefoot. The Soviet leather industry was devastated by the invasion. The United States shipped over 15 million pairs of heavy army boots to the Soviet Union. Every second step taken by a Red Army soldier on the road to victory was taken in American footwear. Then there is the most fundamental fuel of war: calories. When the Germans occupied Ukraine and the agricultural heartlands of Western Russia, the USSR lost over 40% of its arable land. But the disaster went deeper. The Red Army had conscripted almost all the healthy men and requisitioned the horses and tractors. Villages were left with only women, children, and the elderly. In many regions, women literally harnessed themselves to plows to drag them through the frozen earth. Starvation wasn't just a civilian tragedy, it was an acute military threat. A frontline soldier burns thousands of calories a day in combat. You cannot command a starving army, and the Soviet state simply did not have the food to sustain its massive frontline formations. The Allies shipped over 4.5 million tons of food to the Soviet Union. The most famous was the American canned meat, Spam, or tushonka. Soviet soldiers, with their dark, trench humor, grimly referred to these cans as the Second Front. It sounds trivial, canned meat, but calories are ammunition. This food kept the infantry marching through the brutal winters. A starving soldier drops his rifle, loses his morale, and surrenders. American calories kept the Soviet rifle raised, pointing westward towards the Reichstag. But none of this arrived by magic. The logistics of Lend-Lease was a global nightmare, and the price of delivery was paid in blood, steel, and freezing salt water. The most famous, yet most dangerous route was the Arctic convoys, merchant ships sailing from Scotland and Iceland to the frozen ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These civilian sailors braved the worst weather on Earth, navigating through total darkness and ice storms, constantly hunted by German U-boats, surface raiders like the battleship Tirpitz, and Luftwaffe dive bombers. A torpedo strike in the Barents Sea meant death within minutes from hypothermia. The infamous convoy PQ-17 lost 24 of its 35 merchant ships. But the Arctic was only one artery. Because of the danger, the Allies established the Persian corridor. Thousands of American trucks, trains, and supplies were shipped all the way around Africa to the ports of Iran. From there, British and American logistics units drove them through the scorching deserts and treacherous mountains of Iran, directly into the southern Soviet border. Furthermore, thousands of combat aircraft were flown from factories in the United States, across Canada, over the desolate wilderness of Alaska, and into Siberia. We must never forget, British and American sailors burned alive, and pilots crashed in freezing wilderness so that a Soviet soldier could have boots on his feet and a radio in his command post. Did Lend-Lease win the war for the Soviet Union? No. The war on the Eastern Front was won by the unimaginable resilience, sacrifice, and blood of the Soviet soldier. The Red Army paid the ultimate butcher's bill in human lives, over 8 million military dead. That is an undeniable historical fact. But Lend-Lease was the armor, the arteries, and the lifeline. Nikita Khrushchev later confirmed that Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, in private conversations, admitted that if the United States had not helped, the Soviet Union would not have won the war against Nazi Germany. Without Lend-Lease, the war on the Eastern Front would have dragged on for years longer, costing millions of additional lives. The Soviet economy would have shattered under the strain of producing both weapons and the infrastructure to move them. The 4% was not a drop in the ocean. It was the brutal, decisive margin between survival and total logistical collapse. In our next video, we will explore another massive misconception: why the Hollywood image of German infantry firing submachine guns from the hip is a tactical lie, and how the Wehrmacht actually fought. Subscribe to Echoes of War, history without the Hollywood filter.